Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Apologies for a few technical difficulties we had. I just want to start with a few introduction. Welcome to today's lectures as part of Sustainability Council's lecture series. I'm Shirin, and I work at the Sustainability Council at University of Alberta. Today, we will hear from Jen Ria. I would like to start today's lecture with a treaty acknowledgement. The University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory. This land is the ancestral space of the Papas-Chase Cree and Métis Nation, and the traditional territory of Blackfoot, Cree, Dene, Stoney Nakoda, Anishinaabe, and many other Indigenous peoples whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. As a settler, I continue to reflect on what it means to live, work, and play on Treaty 6 territory. I am committed to growing my knowledge and understanding of these important histories and how I can honor the gifts of these lands. The Sustainability Council works with all faculties at our university to spark learning, discovery, and citizenship for sustainability. We offer courses and experiential learning opportunities for students and support sustainability-related research, put on sustainability awareness events, and engage with broader community on sustainability initiatives. Our lecture series is a bi-weekly event which highlights sustainability lecture, teaching, and innovation over a range of topics with the goal of generating conversation on sustainability across disciplines. We are hosting a diverse group of speakers from both University of Alberta and beyond to cover a number of topical issues related to sustainability and sustainable development. Please, for those on Zoom, follow the link we will put in the chat to see all the upcoming lecture series. And to find out more about the Sustainability Council's events and opportunities, please feel free to browse our website and sign up for our newsletter. I will also include these links in the Zoom as well. And at the end of this talk, we will hold a Q&A session. So please put your questions in the chat. Now I'd like to introduce Joan Greer. She is a professor emerita in the Department of Arts and Design at University of Alberta and 2018 recipient of the Campus Sustainability Leadership Award. Combining art history and research curation, Joan works at the intersection of ecocrism, multi-species studies, and decolonial theory. Joan is very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Jen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shireen, and welcome to everyone. I feel like I'm in a room with so many friends. It's just lovely to be here. Lovely to see faces that I don't know, but also it's lovely to see so many that I don't know. Thanks, Jan, again. So I'd like to begin by just welcoming those of you on Zoom as well. And I'd like to also acknowledge that we're gathered together, those of us who are here in person on Treaty 6 territory in Amiskwasi, Waskahikan, or Beaver Hills House, the city colonially called Edmonton, a place where prairie grasslands begin to give way to boreal forests, an age-old traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including, as we've just heard, but I'll reiterate, the Cree, Blackfoot, and Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and teachings have and continue to influence and strengthen our community. Just a couple of acknowledgements before I introduce Jan Ray to you. I'd like to thank the University of Alberta Sustainability Council, and especially Jasmine and Shirin and Andrew for pulling together today's talk just so quickly and nimbly. It was just great. So thank you so much. And also for assisting with promotion, Laurie Yadkin and Sarayan Mukherjee and Olivia LaBelle from the University of Alberta Climate Action Coalition. And if you don't know of the University of Alberta Climate Action Coalition, you can go to its website, caua.ca. So I wanted to put in a plug for that group. And also thanks to Sean Caulfield for helping get the word out today. And so now it's with such great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Jen Ray to you, and many of you don't need an introduction, but nonetheless wonderful to be reminded of some of the things and just very few, because Jen's going to be speaking of more of them, and also it would take hours just to talk about all the wonderful and very important things that Jen Ray has done. Jen Ray is an award-winning artist, researcher of Canadian, Scottish Métis descent, based in Jarrah country, north of Melbourne, Australia. Jen did her BFA here at the University of Alberta, and her graduate work in Melbourne. Her doctorate dissertation was entitled Art and the Anthropocene, Processes of Responsiveness and Communication in an Era of Environmental Uncertainty. Jen's practice-led emergency disaster adaptation and resilience, Jen's practice-led expertise is situated at the intersection of art, speculative futures, and climate emergency disaster adaptation and resilience. Her work is predominantly articulated through transdisciplinary, collaborative methodologies and multi-platform projects, community alliances, and public pedagogies. Jen is co-founder and creative research lead at the Center of Reworlding, a member of the Australian Task Force for Creative Recovery, and a 2023 Creative Australia Fellow. Today's talk is entitled The Role of Culture and the Arts in the Climate Emergency. Jen, once again, welcome over to you.
Yeah, I'll try and project because it's loud. Yeah, I'll try and project a little bit more. I think there's a fan, but if you want to move closer, just in case you can't hear, because you've got a loud fan. You're okay? Okay. I'll just go like this. If I'm not loud enough, then I'll speak up. Yes, and I just want to echo all of the thank yous to the team for bringing this all to fruition at a very short notice. I'm really honored to be here. Edmonton is a place with a lot of memories for me in terms of friends and family. It's where I was born. It's where I did my BFA, and coincidentally, it's where I laid the foundations of the work that I do now were laid, and that's because my sister Geneva set up the I think it was called the ECOS office in 2002. It was the first on-campus sustainability group. I think it might have even been in this building. And what she did is she was trying to do a lot of environmental things. She was telling me about this thing called climate change, and she said, I don't know how to raise awareness up to this. And so a lot of what I was doing was just creating design materials or helping her, with her projects. And then she went to Sweden, and I lost my muse when I went to do my MFA. And also, I also want to, the mentorship of Linda Osborne, who's here as well, working in environmental art practices. I went to Australia with Linda. That's when I really started to really look at, Australia was starting to see some of the impacts of climate much faster than what we were seeing in Canada. And that's, a whole trajectory of things led me to living there. And I've been working in Narm and Jarrah country for 15 years. Treaty 6 territory is also the homelands of our Métis family. So the Nolans, who have ancestral roots in the Red River settlement. There's my aunt right there, Terry Nolan. So one of the things when we do acknowledgements in Australia, they talk about country. The Aboriginal Australians talk about country, and its relationship with all things, sky country, land country, water country, and all of the species. So very similarly, I would like to pay my respect to the traditional custodians here, for it is their relationships with land. It's their kin and their elders. They have the key to healing country, as well as like the ancestral lands of others. And they hold that sort of knowledge, and hopefully by working with sort of their knowledge, working with their knowledge systems, that we can start to think about how we lay the foundations for a livable future for our future ancestors. So today I'm going to be talking a lot about disasters. Some of the stuff will be a little bit triggering, and if that's the case, what we say at the Center for Reworlding is that if we need to have the hard conversations now, because they're only going to get harder. So if you find it triggering or anything like that, I'm really open to having some questions at the end and possibly giving you some other links. So I'm going to now jump in. Okay, so we are living in a period of what we call unness. So the complex, unprecedented, unexpected, uncertain, unstable, unpredictable, unknowable, and the unimaginable. And this is the climate emergency of the now. It has become starkly apparent that the challenges climate change poses are far more severe and more complex than anticipated, with existing systems and ways of thinking poorly equipped to manage. And so without the luxury of time, there's an urgency to find new ways to collaborate, to experiment, to plan, and to shift the paradigm of climate change engagement, especially around disaster resilience. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about some of the creative methodologies and Indigenous pedagogies that might sort of offer valuable insights into how we get from raising awareness around climate change to actually how do we start preparing for what inevitably might happen. I'm going to talk about a project called REFUGE, where we've been working with emergency services and artists and Indigenous knowledge keepers, communities and local government to rehearse climate disasters. And then that'll lead into the work that I'm doing with the Center for Reworlding. So this is a slide I made back in 2010. So but the information is still quite relevant. The question I often ask audience is, I'd like you to just take a moment to think about when you truly understood the magnitude of climate change, what it meant to you, your loved ones, your community, and your country. And just hold on to that thought. This diagram lists some of the potential tipping elements in the Earth's climate system that may affect the timing and severity of climate change impacts in the future. In climatology, the term tipping point refers to a critical threshold at which a tiny I hate this word, sorry, perturbation can qualitatively alter the state or development of a system. It also influences the stability of other vulnerable systems. This is something that's still not. Oh, okay. How do I do that? Okay. Oh, here we go. Yeah, there. Okay. Okay. So one of the things about climate science is that it has not changed very much in the last 30 years. It's only gotten stronger and it's gotten better. And that's thanks to thousands and thousands of scientists that have worked on some of the most rigorous and comprehensive peer-reviewed documents in human history. And that would predominantly be like the IPCC reports. So that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. So despite the abundance of critical literature on the topic of global warming and its potential impacts, such as these tipping points, we have not had the political willpower or the shifts in human behavior to ensure a sustainable and livable future for future generations. So why is that? Well, climate change is complex. Some of the challenges of climate science that climate change communicators face are just as complicated as the subject matter itself. And so while there's a lot of work being done in the mitigation space to reduce carbon emissions and to sort of halt this trajectory that we're on to, which is 1.5 degrees of warming, the reality is that we're going to start experiencing more intense and frequent impacts. That's going to basically affect every single aspect of our lives and livelihoods. One of the things that came out in 2018 that was really quite jarring was in 2018, the IPCC released a document, and it said we have 12 years to prevent 1.5 degrees of global warming. And it was the first time that we had a date and a time, like whereas previously climate change had always been communicated as something over there happening to other people, right? And we saw iconography around polar bears on melting ice caps. We saw droughts. That was predominantly what we were seeing. And that was for myself, that was a really crippling moment because I was dealing sort of with having a young child in a country where we were on water shortages, and 12 years it was. For the first time, it became tangible. So, yeah. Does it go down? Yeah. Sorry. Oh, okay. Sorry, guys.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so what I did is I went, 12 years, and I went back in time. And I went back to 2006, 2007. And that's when Facebook came out, that's when Twitter came out, and that's also when the first iPhone was released. And so if we can consider how social media and mobile technology have completely transformed our global culture in terms of how we can communicate, then it could be reasonable to argue and moderately hopeful that we could transform some of our systems within this 12-year span. Because it took all of the tools and knowledge and skills to get us into this predicament. It's going to take all of the skills and tools and knowledges to come out. So this is where there's the rationale for deep transformative collaboration in terms of how we start thinking about how we adapt within the climate emergency. So basically, we've got 7 years, which is humanity's best window to enact sort of bold transformative change to halt this trajectory of going beyond 1.5 degrees. So this slide here, Lauren Rickards is a professor now at La Trobe University, and she's a part of the Center for Reworlding. Comes from a human geography background, and she was one of the lead authors in the latest IPC report that was on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. I'm not going to go through all the details, but basically the main argument with this was that while we must continue to adapt to climate impacts, the takeaway message from this report is that we're no longer talking about the climate emergency, we're talking about the climate adaptation emergency. So our failure to act in terms of adaptation means that our ability in the future to adapt is going to be compromised. So that window is closing. And so we're looking at potentially cascading physical, social, economic, and flow-on effects that will impact every single aspect of our livelihoods and well-being. So, essentially we need to have a profound reorganizing of things. So this here, I think what's really important is that not only should we be working in our own bubbles, but we need to be amplifying the capacities and voices of those less represented in the climate emergency context. And critical to this process is around acknowledgement, accountability, knowledge transmission, ensuring that the knowledge and research and things that are being produced in places like this university, that information is not behind paywalls, that it's actually accessible, and that it's usable. So disasters 101. Every disaster is different, so therefore every response is different. Disasters can be more than an isolated shock to a system like an earthquake, a hurricane, or wildfire. They can be rapid or slow onset. They can be cumulative, they can be anticipated, or they can just be all of a sudden. They can often amplify pre-existing stressors in communities. So things like the opiate crisis in this country, the cost of living, the difference between sort of the rich and the poor. Natural hazards such as storms, floods, heat waves, droughts are now what we're hearing, thunderstorm asthma events, heat domes, these new terms for new types of disasters. They might be the cause of a disaster, so a freak weather event, but one fundamental outcome of the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction resilience is that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. Disasters are the convergence of between the natural hazard event and the impact on human activities. So this is when you have losses of lives, livelihoods, health, and impacts to sort of the physical, economic, social aspects of businesses, people's lives, communities, countries, etc., and then also to non-human species. In disaster management, they do a lot of speculative exercises. And that's what leads them to different planning and preparedness. This helps local governments and emergency services explore and predict possible scenarios so that they can have that, the disaster plan on the table when these disasters strike. What we've been doing is really thinking about how creative methodologies help inform these plans and practices. but before I get into that, I'm just going to give a little bit of a synopsis on some creative practice. So it was Margaret Atwood at the same time in 2018 when that IPCC report came out that she said that we're no longer talking about climate change, we're talking about everything change. And so how can arts and culture help interpret a turbulent and complex world? Well, there's mountains of evidence in terms of the role of art in social change, disaster recovery, urban transformation, and engaging people with difficult subject matter. I was at an event a few years ago, and somebody was really resistant to what I was talking about. And she said, you know, all revolutions are born out of violence. And I went, no, that's actually not true. They've been born out of art. And so some of the things, you know, Rachel Carlson's at Babel for Tomorrow. Al Gore talks about, you know, it was his mom sitting at the dinner table reading this poem. That poem spoke to, you know, to everyday people about, you know, what was happening in terms of pesticide use in the water systems. Then you have like the freedom songs of the apartheid movement, Charles Dickens' books that led to child labor reform. And then in the one over there is Gap Filler, which is a fantastic project. So they set up a pavilion after the Christchurch earthquakes, and it stayed there for 2 years. There were no community, everything was sort of flattened in those earthquakes. And they became a central hub from everything from like dancing to doing laundry. And then more recently, I love this project. This is called Maps of Gratitude. This whole thing here, by Will Foster and Gabrielle Devici from a Center for Everything. What they did is they mapped the relationships between the fossil fuel industry in Australia and arts organizations. After this artwork was done, Gabrielle Devici quit being an artist in 2019, became a lawyer, ran for council of the local council in Melbourne, became mayor, and is now in the Senate. So between 2009, and she just felt that she needed to get in and see how she could influence change from a political background. But what this map did in terms of like people working in Australia around art and climate has influenced the Climate for Art, which is a whole divestment campaign. And then there's Climate Artists working to help artists get onto boards, to start to disrupt the fact that most of the boards of arts organizations in Australia have, like all the board members are people who are also affiliated with the fossil fuel industry. Yeah, good. Okay, so artists and other cultural producers, they're meaning makers, crafters of experience, provocateurs, adept at dealing with uncertainty and complexity, which is really important at this time. Agile and responsive thinkers who see risk, failure, and critique as fodder. They're resistant to maintaining the status quo, and they're experts at activating the imagination, communication, and working collaboratively, often with communities. Award-winning artist and director David Pledger, he also says that artists are not adverse to crisis, trauma, and disasters. They have a proclivity for putting their fingers in the wound. They can help us see changes that are not yet visible. They can clarify issues that are either latent or have been marginalized. And art does this by representing missing aspects of our society and bringing into view the commons in our culture. So this is really, you know, best illustrated from a project that I've been a core artist involved in since inception. This is called the REFUGE project. It's produced by Arts House, which is City of Melbourne's leading performing arts venue. It's located in the North Melbourne Town Hall, just north of the main CBD of Melbourne. It's a multi-year transdisciplinary project between artists, climate emergency professionals. So that's like the Red Cross, State Emergency Services, Save the Children. There's quite a few involved. Local government, Indigenous knowledge keepers, and then also Melbourne Uni academics. So whenever you ask anybody about Refuge who's been involved in Refuge, they'll give you a different answer. So I'm going to give you my answer, which is it's not your typical art experience, and it's not really a disaster exercise. It fosters a deep engagement with collaboration and partners through a 3-stage methodology. So what we do each year is we have a lab, we explore a topic in depth, where we have all different types of speakers that come and talk to us. that informs the disaster scenario that we're going to rehearse, and then we have an evaluation process afterwards. And what this does is it allows us to, the process is all about opening up rather than synthesizing. So we start to see relationships that through normal planning process and brainstorming processes just don't actually ever get uncovered. Alison McMillan, who works for the Department of Human Services, she talks about how art has this ability to explore risks by the fact that a lot of the people working in her worlds, they don't activate the imagination. And yet for artists like Vanessa Richards, we work in the discipline of the imagination. And this is where we can take people, we can explore risk by engaging in these speculative practices rather than on the ground when these events happen. And when I work really closely with emergency services now, I always say we work with the same material, essentially. We show up, we have this complex situation that's going on, we have to communicate something, and we're sitting there determining what the context is, right? The only difference is that we can explore risk in ways that you can't, because emergency services have to be, they have their systems of top down. They're seen as like, being, what's the word for it? In positions of authority, and people are looking for that authority in terms of decision making. Here. So since 2006, we've rehearsed a flood scenario. We did a heat wave in 2017. We rehearsed a pandemic with the Peter Doherty Institute, which is the largest center for immunology and virology in the Southern Hemisphere. And that was 2 years before COVID. They didn't even want us to use the word pandemic because they said we'll probably scare people. But we stuck to our guns. We did climate-related displacement. We moved online to share the work that we did in pandemic 2020. And in 2021, we started to look at cumulative impacts. What happens when you have multiple scenarios? But one of the really important things about this is that we have this question here is, knowing what we know now, how can we plan and cope with the forecasted scope and scale of climate-induced extreme weather events, while acknowledging the socioeconomic inequalities in terms of who will be impacted and what they will experience? So we have some guiding questions. We ask, what are we practicing? What risks are we taking? What are we preparing for? What are we responding to? And what are we recovering from? So those are the questions that guide us. I brought some magazines and stuff like that, but if you Google Refuge, there's heaps of stuff in terms of ours. We put our scenarios up. There's publications, evaluations, individual projects, and documentation. So one of the key components of this is that we say it's not a drill and it's not a model. Oh, sorry about that. We have because, like I said, every disaster is different. So we are each year it's something new. It's more of engaging in perpetual responsiveness and iterative processes. And we have this dramaturgical methodology called playing in the dark. And what this playing in the dark is, it supports experimentation, risk-taking, negotiating ambiguity. Like I said, where failure and risk are fodder for us. It's about sort of deep listening, trust building. Each of these iterations, it allows us to each iteration and the questions that come out of each informs the next. And what this does is it helps divert or shift traditional ways of knowledge transfer. And so we work with people, we're positioning everybody's legs under the same table, where we're not prioritizing one person's knowledge system over another. And when you think about emergency services, it's all top down, right? Here, it's more of a grassroots approach. Let's see. And one outcome of this is that when the emergency services started working with us in 2016, their approach to preparing a community is to set up a bunch of fire trucks and, in an oval and expect everybody to come to them. They put a lot of resources into this, and they might get maybe 50 members from the community. The first time we did Refuge, we had about 600 or 800 people come in 24 hours. And so they were on board after that. And each year we have more people, you know, online activities. And so Jonathan Craig, who's one of the artists involved, he says, you know, we talk about dealing with a lot of serious subject matter, but we do it in a really fun way. And so that makes what we're doing quite approachable. This is just another one of these complexity maps. This is just a snapshot of our stakeholder constellation in terms of the people that we've worked with over the years. So from rehearsal to reality, Australia, like Canada's experiencing pretty intense weather events of the last couple of years. Because I was doing all of this work, I was like, I don't even have my own kits in order. So I spent 2019 getting my emergency kits in order. And then we experienced the catastrophic bushfires in Australia. And I had created these lists based on a bunch of scenarios from what I've learned from Refuge, and realized that a lot of people in the community were kind of in a state of paralysis, not knowing what to do. And a lot of our community groups were young families. And so I started sharing my list, and my list ended up all over the place, and it caused more problems. So I was commissioned by the City of Melbourne to create this project called Ready, Steady, Go. And you can look it up, it's open source. And what it is it's not about the list of getting yourself prepared, it's actually a list in terms of thinking. If most emergency kits, you know, it's a one size fits all, it doesn't necessarily meet the needs of the people that might, yourself or the people in your family. It doesn't consider comfort, it doesn't consider community building, it doesn't consider what you might do in terms of boredom. And so this project is a really great way to start to think about what are the potential disasters that might affect me, and what are the different scenarios that I might want to be prepared for. What we know is that people who are prepared for disaster events have better outcomes when it comes to response and recovery. Am I going for time? Yeah, I'm all right. Okay. And so equally, in Australia, we had actually, I think it was 267 days of intense lockdown. So Melbourne was one of the most intensely locked down cities in the world. And lucky me, we had the greatest outbreak 20 meters from our back fence. So that's where we were living, and that was the largest outbreak in Australia. I just finished doing some food security work for the local council, and realized after rehearsing a pandemic and doing food security work that our suburb would probably be one of the most highly impacted suburbs in Australia, and was. So for multiple reasons, and I'm going to skip beyond that, but there's some publications coming out of this, and there's a couple of videos online. But essentially, we were able to turn that bowling club in the back there. Response food hub, and supported our. And it wasn't just me; it's just I just said, you know, I've got 15 hours a week, turned into about 6, but I was just using my production skills. Gregory Lorenzini, he's one of the contemporary dancer. Oh, that's right. Yeah. So Gregory Lorenzini was a contemporary dancer, knew a lot about permaculture, came from Brazil. He knew all about terra preta, which is creating a very fertile soil. And he pretty much made that garden happen. And we were able to hire 13 staff to support the community. Following that, the City of Melbourne, who had been a partner with us in Refuge, asked the artists to come and actually co-design and to facilitate their emergency drills. So we had like the head of police, we had like the head of Ambulance Victoria, we had all of these heads of all of these emergency services, and we led them through our sort of dramaturgy. And they did their own evaluation and so forth, but one of the biggest feedback things that we got from the group was that they do these drills every single year, and by the end of the day, half the room is gone. You know, there'll just be a few people left. Everybody stayed. They kept saying they had a really great time, right? And we brought community into the room while they were doing their drills. So they were learning about things like, you know, they had this sort of human element that they hadn't quite considered in their other work. You know, they can get people out of the building, but they don't necessarily consider how they get back. They don't understand, some of the cultural things informing, that can be quite disruptive for people and cause more trauma. So hopefully we'll be doing more of that sort of work. And then some of the legacy stuff is what we've been doing for a number of years. REFUGE is finished in 2022. We've been looking at how we can share the methodology because, like I said, every disaster is different. So rehearsing disasters the way that we have might not actually be possible. So Center for Reworlding set up the Creative Resilience Labs. And we've been working with the City of Vancouver, and that's why I'm back here now, is that we're looking at doing a Pan-Pacific project, looking at the role of artists in disaster preparedness. And then at the same time, keeping the arts very active. The Future of Floating was a residency that happened in Sydney in between the bushfires and the pandemic. And it brought Indigenous artists and settler artists from Canada and Australia to really start looking at how are we going to start engaging from a First Nation perspective around collaborating on emergencies. So we're working with partners with them as well. How am I going for time? So I'll just Claire Coleman, who is being regarded as the Margaret Atwood of Australia. She writes a lot of speculative fiction. We were grouped together on a boat for that residency, and we need to work together. And during COVID, we wrote this film. It was supposed to be a performance, but turned into a film because of the pandemic. What we wrote this film about was we were really interested in the conversations that weren't being had in the climate emergency. We were really interested in talking about intergenerational justice, because short-termism is quite crippling. We have a lot of our planning based on 3 to 5 to 10 year cycles, and we're not talking about laying the foundation for that livable future for young people. We wrote this film as we say it's a blunt force to break the inertia. There's a lot of difficult subject matter in here, but it's a speculative piece. So we didn't anticipate, we didn't anticipate it going any further. And then what happened was we were asked. In the film, it talks about this thing called the Center for Reworlding, and it exists in 100 years from now. And there are people who are thriving in the climate emergency without having the trauma impacts. And somebody asked us, what would it take to actually build the Center for Reworlding? And we hadn't quite considered that. We got about $50,000 just to do the creative development on it, and we established the Center for Reworlding. And what is the Center for Reworlding? It's a collective, because there's no business structures that allow us to do the work at the scale and the scope and the speed that it needs to happen because of institutional constraints. We're a collective of Indigenous, people of color, settler, LGBTIQ+, artists, science thinkers, and change makers that are working at the nexus of arts and culture, disaster management, and climate. And what we tried to do is to bring people together. We've got different programs and projects where we try to get people to understand the context in which we're working, the climate and the disaster work, and we try to amplify the work that's already being done in the community by building relationships. So we've got programs that build capacity in arts and culture and in young people and in the culturally and linguistically diverse communities, and then we get them to the table with emergency services. But one thing that we've just added in is bringing emergency services into creative processes, so getting them to understand speculative practice from a more creative approach, so that everyone gets that sort of capacity building, and then we do scenario planning and looking at how we can reverse for disasters that are very context specific to those communities. I'll just skip part this, but the film was launched at this event at North Melbourne. These are our labs. We've been working Adelaide, we're working Vancouver, we've worked in different councils. There, we're still doing art, still doing exhibitions and drawings. And with these, we try to get people who are outside of the normal art world to come to these exhibitions, since we have programming there as well. Because one of the things as a coming from a visual arts background that I really struggled with as an artist was that I was often presenting work that had really complex ideas, and I was putting them in galleries, and I didn't get to have the relationship with the people that were seeing the work. And I also found that I was preaching to the converted, and then this work would get boxed up and put in a garage, and I'd pay for storage. So that was one of the reasons that I moved more into performance. And so what we say here, these are 2 new flags that we just, or 3 new flags that we just made. Here's our unness. There's our reworlding. And in the film, we say, you know, we came to build a forest, not a bigger tree. And actually, it's funny because we've been talking about mycelium in the last couple of days. And there's an elder from Fitzroy Crossing who says that mycelium is the thing that teaches us to hold hands with one another, which I think is just really quite beautiful. Yeah, so there's my contact details, and I'm happy to take any questions.